board. Good evening. Welcome to MED110 5NEX Tuesday evenings. This is week 7, September 14. What is due this evening, of course, is task 6, discussion 6, lesson 6. And what are we doing this week? We are doing respiratory, which is chapter 22 in our textbook. And if we look further down, structure, of course, of the respiratory system, since it is an anatomy class. How and what is respiratory gas exchange? And kind of mention it here, oxygen and carbon dioxide transport from the cells to lungs. So first, let's start off with why in heaven's names do I have to breathe? Well, we all talked about in the first couple of lectures that we have to create energy for us to live. And in order for that to happen, we have to have glucose and oxygen. And we already talked about the digestive system, how we digest and metabolize food to make glucose. Now, how do we extract oxygen from the air? And I'm clicking on the wrong things, of course. How do we extract oxygen from the air for that second part of this component of how do we live and make ATP? So it makes common sense medically and surgically that you have to be able to breathe. And it is a constant thing. And if anything gets in the way of this gas exchange, of course, oxygen is the thing that we need to make our ATP. And we know in every vehicle or in every vehicle, there's always gas tank with gas, right? A fuel, which is oxygen. And then there's always has to be some sort of byproduct, some sort of waste. And of course, that's carbon dioxide. And hence the term gas exchange. We're exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide. So when I inhale, I'm inhaling air, which has around 21% oxygen, and I'm going to extract that oxygen. And then when I exhale, I'm going to exhale carbon dioxide because that's that's the waste product of all this metabolism or this breakdown of all these chemicals. And coincidentally, that's why we should also focus on, greenhouse effect and plants and trees and that kind of thing. That's also important to human beings because it makes sense because human beings take in carbon dioxide and then breathe out oxygen. So it's a nice little symbiotic relationship we have here. So when we're looking at the function of the respiratory system. Let's see, good, I clicked on that. When we're looking at the function of the respiratory system, when its main function is, of course, gas exchange, and for the necessary oxygen that we need. Now, there's something called when we look at the respiratory system, let me enlarge this. The respiratory system, and you can see it here, is comprised of an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. Now, here's your trachea, and that's your windpipe. And then everything above it is your upper respiratory tract. So your nasal cavity is in here, and your oral cavity and your pharynx. And of course, here's your the cartilaginous larynx or voice box, which is right here. So all of that from the trachea on up, that's upper respiratory tract. Now, that is a non-conducting zone. That means air just goes in and out of there. There's no gas exchange. It's when you look at it in a simplified manner, it's just a set of tubes, no big deal. But the lower respiratory tract, which is a little bit more dangerous and is called the conducting zone, because once it gets down to the level of the lungs, that's where there's gas exchange, and we're going to talk about that in greater detail. So right now, you need to know the difference between upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. And the trachea, which is your windpipe, demarcates everything from the trachea on up, upper respiratory. Everything from the trachea on down, lower respiratory. And the lower respiratory tract infections and the lower respiratory tract problems are the more serious problems. Anything that you got up here, like sinusitis, Maybe you have a little bit of sore throat, pharyngitis. Maybe it might get down to the level of laryngitis. Everything all up here, and even the sinuses, the spaces here in your skull. Sinusitis, they're upper respiratory tract infections. No biggie, something that you really shouldn't go to the hospital for. But if you have a lower respiratory tract infection, and we're talking about things like bronchitis, emphysema, pneumonia, those will affect the conducting zones or the places where there is gas exchange. And that's when it gets dangerous. So you have a conducting zone, which is lower respiratory tract, and a non-conducting zone. And in some textbooks, they call it the dead space because that upper respiratory tract doesn't contribute to gas exchange. So let's start at the top, nasal. Now, if you look at the respiratory tract, we mentioned it before, everything's covered in, of course, like an inner skin. So there's epithelia. And of course, it's going to have a lot of goblet cells and mucus. Did I press record? Good. I just had to make sure. And you could see here your nasal cavity. There's really these little shelves, and they're called nasal conchae. And they're little shelves, and these things could get gummed up, especially if there's a buildup of mucus and whatnot, especially if you have sinusitis and upper respiratory tract infection. And you can see here your sinuses, which are spaces in your skull, which one, help your skull stay light. Two, they also provide, if you've ever heard the term regarding speakers, it's called baffles. Like, it's the reason why speakers sound good. And it's also partially the reason why your voice is so appealing to you, because you're listening to it through the most complicated, most beautiful stereo system, which is, of course, your skull. But we all know that when you get sinusitis, all this starts filling up and gets gummed up. Your head feels like a bowling ball. And also if the mucus buildup is here, you have a hard time breathing, hard time swallowing if it's pharyngitis. Now you could see here the trachea, which is located anteriorly in your throat here, and the esophagus, the food tube, is down here posteriorly. And we're going to talk more about the trachea in a minute, but you have here this flap here of cartilage, and that's part of it is your epiglottis. And that prevents you from breathing while you are eating. So if you're eating, this epiglottis folds. So actually, when you're eating and drinking, you are temporarily holding your breath so that the food or fluid can go down here into your esophagus, also known as your food tube. But when you're talking, of course, and that also goes by the rule, you shouldn't talk while, you shouldn't eat or drink while you talk, because then you're going to start to choke and you're going to start having a gag reflex. Let's look at the epithelium. It's pseudostratified columnar epithelial because it looks kind of like a bunch of columns. And then you'll see here, you'll notice this thing looks like a wine glass. You got to use your imagination a little bit. And those are goblet cells because all the epithelia are lined with mucus for two reasons. One, lubrication of the area, keep it moist so that there's chemical reactions and whatnot. But the main reason is for non-specific immunologic function where, it traps all the dirt, virus, and whatnot. And you have these cilia, these little tiny hair-like projections that push all that mucus with all those potential pathogens, up the respiratory tract so that you can do what? Spit it out. Hard palate, soft palate, another view of the epiglottis, again, anteriorly, your trachea, also known as your windpipe, and posteriorly, you have your esophagus, which is your food pipe. Also, the thing about the oropharynx, we already talked about before, it has tonsils, it has a lot of immunologic structures there, like your tonsils, because your oropharynx And your oral cavity is a very, very dirty place, and especially dirty as in pathogenic. There's a lot of potential pathogens in there, especially because air goes through there, food goes through there, and no matter how much you microwave your food, there's always going to be a significant amount of bacteria on it. Oh, let's see. Thyroid cartilage, nice to know. Epiglottis, we already saw. Vocal folds, that's in your cartilaginous larynx, right? And just like it's got to be stiff but not hard, it's got to be strong but still have the capability of being pliable, just like the strings of a guitar. And that's actually how you create sound, also known as phonation. Okay. Now, the trachea, what's so special about it? Well, it's the windpipe. And if you'll notice, anteriorly, it's covered like a C shape with cartilage. And it makes sense because that has to stay open. Now, the back part of it, or the posterior side of it, let's see if we can show it from another angle. Oh, here's a little bit. So you can use your imagination that it's C-shaped. It covers the left and right sides of the trachea and the front, but not the back. And then you could be asking yourself, well, whoever made us, why didn't they just make the whole tube so the tube will never have to close up? Well, remember, your esophagus is in the back part of it, and you could see how thin it is here. But when there's food coming down it, it has to expand. And also, you shouldn't be breathing as the food is going down your esophagus. So that's why whoever built us, or whatever built us, whatever you believe built human beings, that's why the trachea is C-shaped cartilaginous rings. Now, when we're at the doorstep or the pathway through our lower respiratory tract, you have this separation here into the right main stem bronchus to the left main stem bronchus, or the primary bronchi. Bronchi means plural, bronchus, singular. And you'll notice that the right one is shorter and fatter than the left one. And that presents a little bit of a pathologic issue, especially with foreign body. So if foreign body tends to fall, most likely it'll affect the right lung first, and you could see why. This is shorter, more shallow, and more directly down into the right lung versus the left lung. Now, you could see also then it progressively, your bronchus starts progressively getting smaller and smaller and smaller, like the branches on the tree. Now, as they go smaller and smaller and smaller, the trachea on the bronchus gets replaced by smooth muscle. And remember, what do we know about smooth muscle? It is not controllable. I can't say to my lungs, stop breathing right now. I can't stop gas exchange or stop expanding. I can't control it. So remember, visceral, also known as smooth muscle, is not controlled consciously. Okay. That's why if you get bronchitis, it's going to squeeze, and it's not going to be in any of your control. So remember, we'd call this whole area here of the lungs the conducting zone. Oh, by the way, this fork in the road is called your carina, C-A-R-I-N-A. And then you have the right main stem bronchus, also known as your right primary bronchus. And then you have your left primary bronchus, also your, what did I mention before? The right one is more prone to foreign body than the left main stem bronchus. Now, what's at the end of these branches when they get smaller and smaller and smaller? Well, at the end, this is the conducting zone. This is the dangerous part. And that's why lower respiratory tract infections garner way more attention than your upper respiratory tract infection, like a sinusitis. That's why when you get a letter from the doctor, and unfortunately your boss is a medical professional and knows a thing or two about medical terminology or pathology, you get a letter from the doctor saying, "Oh, please excuse my patient for an upper respiratory tract infection." It looks fancy and schmancy, URTI, but in all actuality, you're not going to die. But the issue is that if you let it go and don't take care of yourself, it may progress to your lower respiratory tract, and it will cause problems. Because this is where gas exchange occurs. And where does it occur? It occurs right here in the capillaries. Now, if you look at the ends of the terminal bronchioles, there is no more cartilage. It's now all replaced by smooth muscle. And also at the end, there's this bunches of grapes called your alveolar sac. And it's around these bunches of grapes, and especially in the area of the capillaries, right? You have your venule here, right? That's deoxygenated blood, carbon dioxide. And in your red arterioles here, and that is your red blood cells are carrying oxygen. So this is exact location of the gas exchange at these capillaries. So oxygen goes in because I need it, and carbon dioxide has to go out. So if there's anything that happens here in the conducting zone, that's a dangerous, dangerous place to be if there's a pathology. Now, you could even look at this further. If you look at the pictograph here, or micrograph of your alveolar sac, it's thin, one-celled. And if you look at the blood vessel, the capillary is thin and it's a single-celled, and it facilitates oxygen and carbon dioxide moving in and out of here very easily. That's why we don't like any foreign body or smoke or asbestos or dust particles. And you could also see how it would be easy for a virus to come in here from the air and then go in here, right? Now, how does this stuff stay open and facilitate oxygen going in, carbon dioxide going out? Well, you got these specific cells. You have type 1 alveolar cells, which they're squamous epithelial, and they're relatively thick and highly permeable to gas. And to facilitate the alveolar type 1 cell to keep open, as you can see here, it's all open, right? They're like, you can look at it like little bubbles. All these bubbles are open because of type 2 alveolar cells, and they produce something called pulmonary surfactant, which is a phospholipid / protein stuff. And this is highly active, especially in newborn children. So if the baby is very premature, for example, I forgot how many weeks, it's some ridiculous number, like 6-8 weeks premature. And I was on a respirator, and they were also giving me a whole bunch of surfactant, because without the surfactant, there won't be any. The best way to explain it is, do you know how, if you've ever seen this? Ever see how a mosquito, it's so light that how it just like sits on top of a piece of water, right? See how it, and also how water kind of bubbles up like this. And if you look at the pictures here, do you see it's kind of the alveolar sacs kind of naturally bubble up? Well, pulmonary surfactant is responsible for that surface tension. Without it, these things don't bubble up. They don't have spaces. If there's not enough room or not enough space, the oxygen and carbon dioxide won't be able to exchange. And in my case, the baby will have a very hard time breathing. So alveolar, type 1 alveolar cells, they are the squamous epithelia, which make the structure of the alveoli. But it is the type 2 alveolar cells create pulmonary surfactant. And the function of pulmonary surfactant is to provide that surface tension to keep all of these airways open for gas exchange. Now, remember we talked about foreign body is easy to get into our lungs. We're breathing it all day, every day. We have mucus, which is to protect us. We also have macrophages all throughout the conducting zones of our deep inside our lungs to also protect us from any potential pathogen. And you could see, this is just a quick example of asthma, even also bronchitis, where you could see how the mucus is too much. See, this is normal mucus. I get my epithelial cells and the cilia, it can easily move that mucus and move it out, especially if it has pathogen in it. But if it's got a lot of mucus, then the cilia will have a hard time moving all of that stuff out. That's why we always have to be in the middle. We always have to be homeostatic and in balance. Now, if you're looking at the lungs, the external structures of the lungs, the right lung is separated into 3 lobes. You have your superior lobe, middle lobe, and inferior lobe. That's how you know you're in your right lung. And of course, it's in the right side of your patient. Now, the left only has 2 lobes. It only has a superior and inferior lobe. And what's special about the left lung is, you see how it has this little notch? That's your cardiac notch. And this is where your heart would sit, right in here. Now, you have your pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein to go into your lungs. And remember, the box diagram video, I hope you guys watched it. The pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein are exceptions to the generalized rule that arteries are typically going away from the heart and are typically oxygenated. Well, the pulmonary artery is deoxygenated, and the pulmonary vein, that's the oxygenated one. So the blood supply in the respiratory circulation is a little bit on the backward side. So if you can think of it that way. Innervation, known as the pulmonary plexus. And remember, all of this stuff that's in your lungs is smooth muscle. You have no control over it. So if you have bronchoconstriction, like you would have in asthmatics, and also people who have foreign body infiltration of their lungs, your lung doesn't like it, so it'll start squeezing, and that's bronchoconstriction. Okay, but of course there's bronchodilation if you have sympathetic nervous or fight or flight activation, because you want to open up your lungs. And actually, the performance enhancing drugs, your PEDs that, athletes keep on getting caught taking and stuff like that, one of them does this. It provides extra bronchodilation during strenuous exercise. And if you're a runner, you're an athlete, you open up your nose, you open up your lungs, you'll have more oxygen coming in. More oxygen coming in means more ATP, more fuel, more performance. Now, the lungs, just like everything else, is important and has a covering, just like the heart. But the covering of the lungs is called your pleura. Your pleura, just like your pericardium in your heart that we had at the last lecture, you have 2 layers. You have your parietal layer, which is on the outside, and your visceral layer, which is on the inside. And remember, utilize your medical terminology powers. Viscera means guts, so it has to mean the layer on the inside. And in between, the pleural cavity is a potential space, just like your pericardium. And it has a little bit of fluid in there because, of course, not only for protection, the pleura protects your lungs, it also provides a decrease of friction, kind of like lubrication to the lungs. So every time you're breathing, it doesn't rub. And if it rubs the wrong way, many of you who have ever had a really bad cough, it's called pleurisy, right? Plurisy. Have you ever had a really bad cough and your sternum starts hurting and it feels like there's a knife on your chest, or a really coarse sandpaper. Well, that's because this pleural cavity, this pleural space got infected. And it gets infected, gets really painful. And then, of course, if it's pain, how easy is it for my patient to breathe? Now, how do you actually breathe? I think that's the next part, if I recall. Yep. How do you breathe? Well, we already know about the diffusion. We already know about everything in the universe runs from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, which is essentially the law of diffusion. Well, the lungs also follow other laws of physics, and one of them is Boyles Law. Boyles Law is the relationship between pressure and volume. And you could sit and try to memorize this, and read this. I like pictures. I'm a simple guy. And this is what it means. Boyles Law. So if you open up your lung volume, right, what happens to the molecules? They have more room to play around with. And who's tweeting me? You have more area to play around with. And therefore, if you have more area, more freedom, more space, less pressure. So as volume increases, pressure decreases. But if I decrease the volume of my lungs, what happens? The pressure will increase. So what Boyles Law states is that there's an inverse relationship between pressure and volume. So if the pressure increases in the lungs, that means the volume should decrease. If the volume, and vice versa, okay? So that's Boyles Law. Now, let's look at this. And let's talk about the intrapleural pressure. Now, you don't have to memorize 760 millimeters of mercury minus 756 or whatever, but in the future, for future training, you definitely will. But for my exam and for your take on it, you have to be able to understand how is it that you breathe. So let's look at it this way. The two main muscles of respiration are your intercostal muscles. They're in between your ribs right here, and your diaphragm, which is that long, flat muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. Again, you have your trachea here, carinae, right main stem bronchus, left main stem bronchus. So how do you inhale? Well, the first thing your body wants to do is, and let's draw it. The first thing your body wants to do, and this is inhale. The diaphragm is going to contract, and then like a syringe, it's going to create a negative pressure. I'm going to put a big minus sign here in my lungs, because the atmospheric pressure is, when I inhale, is positive. So we already know the laws of diffusion, that if I'm coming from an area of high concentration, which is atmospheric pressure, to an area of low concentration or negative pressure, in this case of the lungs, then I am inhaling. Therefore, the air should come from the outside atmosphere inside. It's kind of like a bellows or a syringe. When you draw up the syringe, right, it creates a negative pressure. So what happens? The fluid goes into the syringe, or the medication goes into the syringe, just like air. So my diaphragm drops down. Of course, what happens? My lungs expand, right? Right? When we're inhaling, my chest wall goes up and out. It creates a negative pressure here. And then what happens? And air pressure on the outside is positive and then it goes in. So that means I'm inhaling. Now, how do I exhale? Well, I take in all the air that I can. So what happens? At the very top of my breathing, all the air gets in here, but then it creates what? A positive pressure. So if this pressure is greater, right, than the atmospheric pressure that's outside, I should now exhale. Now, geez, writing with a mouse is really, really, really ugly. And it's right here. Let's write inhale over here. So to recap, it's all about pressure gradients. If you have no pressure gradient, then you won't breathe. So when you inhale, it's active. The intercostal muscles and your diaphragm all contract, so that increases the volume. Increase the volume according to Boyles Law. I'm going to create a negative pressure. Therefore, positive atmospheric pressure greater than negative internal lung pressure. So it goes. The air will go from the outside in. That's inhalation. Okay, and it requires muscles. The two muscles, again, I'll repeat, is your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm. Now, when you exhale, right? When you inhale all the way at the top, you're going to have a lot of pressure, right? Because now all the air is coming in and it's going to get concentrated and it's going to exert more pressure. Then the pressure on the inside of the lungs will be greater than atmospheric. And then you'll naturally what? Passively let go. So, and you can also notice by my example, right? It takes way longer to exhale, right? Almost like 3-to-1. I forgot the exact ratio, but inhalation is active, requires muscles, but exhalation is passive, doesn't require muscles. All you have to do is what? Let go. And then it starts all over again. Now, what if someone poked a hole in my pleura? Then there will be the pressure on the inside will equal the pressure on the outside. Then what will happen? My lung will collapse and I won't be able to breathe. Okay. So that's why these pressure gradients are really important regarding breathing. Okay. So, and you could see the force, the force or ventilation equals the change in the ratio between why am I doing this? This is not a physics class. All right. Just know that what? There's an internal pressure and there's an external pressure, and that the different interplays within the pressure can dictate inhalation and exhalation. But if anything ever poked the hole, like a knife wound, bullet wound, or I don't know, anything, foreign body, right, then we'd have a problem. And you can see here, diaphragm goes down, and what happens to the chest? And if you notice, that's why your ribs have cartilage on it. So you can move just a little bit enough so that upon inhalation, diaphragm goes down, the chest moves up and out, and then it increases the lung volume here, creating a negative pressure. And that's how we have inhalation. And then when you relax, that's how you have expiration. Okay. Now, this will be more important to you as you get closer to your NCLEX or MCAT, and either one. But these are your lung volumes and lung capacities. Tidal volume is your normal quiet breathing, not talking, just breathing, just living your life. So that's a little bit under 500 cc's or 500 milliliters. but you also have an expiratory reserve volume, which is like 1.5 liters. And that is where, while you're breathing, you have a little bit more to give on the expiration. And also when you're quiet breathing, you also have a lot more that you can inspire or inspirate. So you have IRV, which is your inspiratory reserve volume. Tidal volume is your normal quiet breathing. Expiratory reserve volume, or ERV, is that extra bit, like after you talk, how you could still, have some air left to exhale. Now you got a little bit over 1 liter left in what they call just residual volume. And inspiratory capacity is your capacity of quiet breathing, which is tidal volume, plus IRV, which is inspiratory reserve volume. And that's inspiratory capacity. FRC, or functional residual capacity, is your expiratory reserve volume plus your residual volume. Vital capacity is your IRV, tidal volume, plus your ERV. And of course, total lung capacity is what? Everything. And in the typical model, it's about 6 liters. Or 6,000 milliliters, or 6 liters. And please note that sometimes I say cc instead of ml. The cubic centimeter, or 1 cc, is equal to 1 ml. So 1 cubic centimeter is equal to 1 milliliter. Okay, so, and everything that I just explained is here as well. And why do you need to know these volumes is because eventually, if you're going to have training on how to use a spirometer, and it's also how we measure how my patient is improving. And sometimes the spirometers are like, maybe you see it, it looks like a kazoo. If you ever, see one of these things, here's a fancy digital one. But it's got these little pumps, and it tells you, and you're supposed to exhale, and you're supposed to do pulmonary function tests and breathing tests. But there's also a bigger machine. There's this big machine. Yeah, it's like this, but it has these screens, and it'll show this. And it'll print it out, and then it'll also print out all these lung volumes. And from what we know about the lung volumes, we can confirm diagnoses. And this is called spirometry. Okay. For me, nice to know, but these other stuff that we talked about, a little bit more important. But if you're interested in for future reference, you're interested to be in pulmonary medicine, yeah, you got to know all these. Now, how does our brain control us? Now, if you look at the level of the pons, that is where we control our breathing. And if you'll notice it, it's in the base of the brain, sitting inside here. So a whole bunch of bad can happen to all of this other brain material. So whoever built us real smart. The vital center for our breathing is deep. And that's why you can also see here, if my patient has a basal skull fracture and you have funny breathing, then I know what? Maybe the pons or the medulla got affected, and that's dangerous. So if we look at this, you have your VRG and your DRG and what they call the PRG. So what are these things? PRG is the pontine respiratory group, of course, located where? In your pons. And you have the pneumotaxic center, which means it is a negative response. So it'll slow down your breathing. And then you have your apneustic center, which will, as you can see here, increase your breathing. Now your VRG and DRG, right, are located in your medulla, that part of your brain that's right next to the pons, right? And they, of course, in turn, VRG, ventral, so that's your intercostal muscles. And dorsal, of course, the things in the back, right? Or here, in our case, the diaphragm. So this is how I always remember it. Dorsal diaphragm, dorsal root ganglion, ventral respiratory group, or DRG and VRG, they're located at the level of the medulla. And of course, PRG, which is the pontine respiratory group, located at the level of the pons, all at the basal part of your brain. Now, you'll also see here accessory respiratory muscles. If any of you ever had any family who had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease like emphysema, chronic bronchitis, really bad asthma, you could see how their shoulders kind of move and kind of help their intercostal muscles. And when you're using your accessory respiratory muscles, that means you're having a hard time. Another way to identify your accessory respiratory muscles is sprint. Try to run as fast as you can on the treadmill, and then stop and look at yourself in the mirror. And then you'll see your shoulder girdle, your shoulders will start moving. And normal quiet breathing doesn't require your shoulders and your back and all that other stuff. Let us see. Next. We've now already talked about gas exchange, right? And I also mentioned around 21% or so is oxygen, okay? And in reality, the thing that your brain monitors is not your O2 level. It monitors your carbon dioxide level that is diffused in your cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so there are specialized chemoreceptors that monitor CO2. We have chemoreceptors that also monitor O2, but CO2 is the thing that triggers us to breathe. So if I have an increase of CO2, what's going to happen? I am going to breathe more because I want to get that stuff out and I want to get more oxygen in. But you could also see the majority of gases in normal air or atmospheric air is nitrogen, if ever you want to win a Jeopardy or something. But oxygen only around 21%. Because anything more than that, it's not good. Everything has to be in a balance. Ventilation, perfusion, gas exchange, and as we could see here, right? In the alveolus, what has to go in? Oxygen. What has to come out? Carbon dioxide. And if you could look at here, you could see that the carbon dioxide is the end product. That and of course some water vapor. Carbon dioxide is the end product of all this metabolism of the oxygen coming in here, going into the hemoglobin, and then being utilized. And this is the red blood cell. Okay. Question? Anybody? No? We're good? Okay. Let me check attendance one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. And the fifth one, I got you. Just to make sure. So respiration just means the exchange of gases. What two gases? Oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now you have atmospheric respiration, which is where the air from the outside world goes into our lungs. And you could see here, oxygen and carbon dioxide internally can go in and out of cells. And that's cellular respiration, okay? And also they go in and out of your alveoli, which is pulmonary respiration. A hyperbaric chamber. Anyone here a diver? No? No one took a diving class? Well, if you ever come up too quick from a dive, end up in one of these for a couple of days. It's called Caisson's disease. Now, if we look at here, something more important than Caisson's disease, because I don't think anybody on this call, and myself included, will be going deep sea diving anytime soon. On the red blood cell, we know it's a biconcave disc. It looks like a Cheerio or a Lifesaver. It may look like there's nothing in the middle, but what's in the middle is a hemoglobin molecule. The hemoglobin, hemo stands for blood, globin stands for protein, and that's what it is. It's a bunch of coiled proteins. But if you use your imagination just a little bit, and with a heme group or an iron group right in the middle, can you see this looks like a bent up lawn chair where something can sit on it? This one too, this one too, this one too. Well, either oxygen or carbon dioxide can sit on that. And that's why red blood cells are in the greatest abundance of in number in our blood. And it makes sense because I need gas exchange and I need it to live. Okay. And if ever you're going to study for the MCAT, which is the Medical College Aptitude Test, you're going to need to know the hemoglobin dissociation curves. But for our level, what we really need to know is that there is an optimal pH for everything. And for human beings, it's 7.4, right? That's physiologic pH. And also, if you look at here, I don't want to go too far into it. There's also an optimal curve for oxygen and hemoglobin dissociation, meaning because if oxygen can't get onto this little chair and jump right off, then you won't be able to have gas exchange. So that's what these curves are. And you could see the optimal pH for blood should be 7.4. The optimal pH for a human being should be 38 degrees Celsius, as you can see here. And if it's too hot or too cold or the pH is off, it will definitely affect your breathing by controlling on how easy oxygen hops on and hops off. Now, carboxyhemoglobin, which holds carbon dioxide, well, guess what? If you tried to lock yourself in the garage with the car running and carbon monoxide got here, it sticks to this like glue. And that's why you can't breathe when you're breathing in carbon monoxide, because the affinity for the carbon monoxide for these heme groups is very, very strong. There is no dissociation, so it'll stick there. And if it sticks there, the oxygen won't move. Oxygen doesn't move, you can't breathe. And then you go sleepy. And if it's prolonged, you go sleepy permanently. And you could see how carbon dioxide plus water, right? Carbonic anhydrase is, of course, the enzyme that converts CO2 and water to what's this thing called? Bicarbonate. Oh, well, this is bicarbonate, and this is H plus, which, by the way, you know what? Do I want to do this? I'm going down the rabbit hole regarding pH and stuff like that. No, let's ignore that part. Of course, hyperventilation or hypernia, increased depth and rate of ventilation. There's also altitude effects, and we already talked about the effects of temperature and the effects of pH as well. Let's see. All the rest of this is, yep, good. We're already at the end. So let us look at, did we go over everything we went over? Let's look at task 7. And that's why they call it, if you'll notice, cellular energetics, because that's what breathing is. It's the acquisition of the first parts of that equation, which is, of course, oxygen. Here's nice quick Carolina notes in the task. Let's see if you open up here. See, real neat. And ATP and respiration. Nice to know. Watch this video, of course. Did we talk about gas exchange? Did we talk about oxygen and carbon dioxide, how they get transported around in the red blood cell? We did. Structure of the respiratory system, upper versus lower. Yes, we did. So I think we are good. Let me look at lesson 7 and let's see what we have down here. So let's look at the case, which is due next week. Mystery case study in cellular respiration, section 1, section 2. Yeah, do all 4. It's quick. There's only 3 or 4 questions each. So again, to repeat, case study for lesson 7, due next week, do all questions. Seems pretty, and again, like I said, just short answers. Some of you write a book. Actually, many of you write very well, but in my opinion, you do use way too many words just to say something simple. Keep things simple. Makes life easier. What does the discussion look like so I can give you a hint? Discussion. Sorry if I'm making you dizzy. I'm making me dizzy. So let's look at discussion. Technology is allowing testing's lung capacity to be done remotely. Okay. Actually, we've been doing that for 20 years. But remember when you were talking about technology, telehealth, right? Find a device that monitors health conditions and articles 2020, 2021, because we're talking about technology and what are the benefits and for telehealth. And how's this? If we're going to be talking about benefits, are there any unwanted side effects of telehealth? Okay, especially rural healthcare. Are there any bad things about this? Like a quick example right off the top of my head, people don't talk to people physically anymore. Myself included. I'm more used to just answering emails and seeing patients face to face is now very, very different. So there's advantages and disadvantages about that. So remember, when you're having your APA 7th edition citation, make sure it's from like late 2020, 2021, because we are discussing technology. So due for next week, task 7, which is your concept map, discussion 7, and of course lesson 7 case. Now, next week we're having lab. So how does the lab go down? The lab will be, let me write it down since I'm talking, and I'll also write it in announcements. So the laboratory, we have 2 laboratory sessions. Of course, this week is week 7. It goes week 8 is lab, week 9 is lab, and week 10, that's the final. Oh, I can't type for the life of me today. So starting next week, Health Lab 1, 4th floor, Alexandria campus. Okay. And it'll be 6 p.m. promptly to no later than 8. I like doing my labs. Once we go in there, we get out. The first laboratory will be dissecting and going through heart, and the second lab, which is week 9, will be going over full systems from snout to tail on a fetal pig. And it'll be from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Now, if you cannot make these times, it's okay. Take the hit. Be my guest. Take the hit on attendance, but the attendance is mandatory. So, meaning to say is, if you're there, even for a minute, I got to put you down as attended. If you're not there at all or can't get to a makeup day, then I have to put down absent. So just don't go 3 consecutive days absent. Like, don't be absent, like, week 8, week 9, week 10, right? And of course, week 10 is the final. I hope no one's absent for that. It is at this time that I'm going to stop.